The story I want to look at this morning is one of Hannah Dodge's least favorite stories. She may not know it. She may not remember it. But about 6 years ago, I preached on this story. Some of you will remember this. I preached on this story, and just as I got to a certain part of my sermon, Aaron had just walked back in the sanctuary after getting Hannah to sleep. You don't remember this, do you, Hannah? No. Aaron walked into the sanctuary just as Hannah had gotten to sleep, and as I was telling this story about these two blind men screaming at the top of their lungs, I screamed at the top of my lungs. Some of you remember this? Yeah, you remember this. It's 6 years ago. And when I finished screaming at the top of my lungs, over in that part of the church, there was this, ah! And I had awakened Hannah. So hopefully she still likes this story. There's actually a video on YouTube named Pastor Frank Awakens Sleeping Children. I didn't want to show it to you today, but you can go home and look on YouTube, and you can search under Pastor Frank and Sleeping Children, and it's pretty funny. Well, Lindsay, the good news is that Anna Lee would not, Avonlea would not, I'm not doing that this morning, so I'm not going to wake her up. Because the point of my sermon is a different point today. But I want to look again at this story, Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 through 34. It says, as they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed him being Jesus. And behold, there were two blind men sitting beside the roadside. And when they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. The crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent, but they cried out all the more, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And at this point in time is when I screamed, and of course that whole story. And stopping, Jesus called them and said, what do you want me to do for you? They said to him, Lord, let our eyes be opened. And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him. Now, this is paralleled in Mark and Luke also. In Mark and Luke, there's only one blind man. For some reason, they just recorded it that way. In Mark, we're told that his name is Bartimaeus, blind Bartimaeus. So some of you remember him, the son of Timaeus. And the point in that sermon was the blind men were not going to allow Jesus to get out of their sight. They screamed. They would not be ignored. Though they could not see Jesus, they were going to make sure that Jesus saw them. And so they screamed. And the point of that sermon was, don't let anything hold you back from making sure that you get to Jesus. Jesus' question, I love his question, what do you want me to do for you? And they knew exactly. They knew exactly, and they said, we want our eyes to be healed. And so, their eyes, who knows what they looked like, but their eyes, Jesus touched them. He didn't always touch people when doing miracles, but he touched their eyes. They received sight, and they could see. Now, what I really want you to see now, after we've seen the story, is what happened next. It's just a simple little phrase in the passage. It says they could see, and they followed him. They followed him. Now, I have to tell you, this is a very inauspicious time to start following Jesus. Jesus is in Jericho. Jesus is about to go up the hill, way up to Jerusalem. I've ridden in a bus from Jericho up to Jerusalem. It's uphill all the way, literally. And they are about to go up to Jerusalem, and on Sunday, Jesus has the triumphal entry, and 5 days later, he's crucified. These guys picked the worst time to be a follower of Jesus because they really didn't get to know him very long. Just about a week. And as I was reading this story, I was struck by two parallel verses. And they are the way we started the text and the way we ended it. Notice verse 29. It says, "As they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed him." And then verse 34. "And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him." You have two peoples following Jesus. The crowd followed him, and then the newly sighted, formerly blind men followed Jesus. But it's the same word, but it's a very different experience. I went to the Greek, as a good preacher should, hoping that the two words were different. No such luck. As if you really want to know this, the word is akalutheo. And it's an interesting word. It's a compound word. And the word literally means, the first half of the word means union, and the last half means road. And so it's kind of like joining each other on the road. So it's kind of like walking together, following together. So you see the definition there. It says to be united with the road or in union with a way, one going in the same way with or accompanying another. So accompanying. So as I thought about this word and I applied it to the two groups of people who were akalutheoing Jesus, they were following Jesus, I'm just struck by the contrast. The crowd were following Jesus, it says. But they weren't really following him other than the fact that they were on the same road he was on. They weren't really following Jesus. They just happened to be walking in the same vicinity as he was. Because Jesus, at this point in time, he was famous. He was famous in Jericho. They knew who he was. When Jesus came to town, the crowds gathered around him. This was the happening place. And I have to tell you, I think there were very many hangers-on. They didn't really want to be with Jesus. They just wanted to be where somebody famous was. You contrast that with the two disciples, these two formerly blind men. Their experience is a totally different experience. They weren't just following Jesus. They were following Jesus. They were following Jesus very closely. They had taken steps to Christ, and now they were walking with Christ. He was the one who had given them sight. He was the one who had saved their very existence. I mean, all that they could do when they were blind was be beggars. This totally changed the rest of their life. And I think it's hardly fair to use the same word for both groups. One just happened to be going in the same direction Jesus was. But the other group, the two formerly blind men, you always have to put formerly in there, don't you? You can't call them the two blind men because they're no longer blind. The two formerly blind men, they're following Jesus in a very different way. And from this, I formulated a question that I want to ask you this morning. And the question is this: is it possible that just because you are going in the same direction as Jesus is going, doesn't necessarily mean you are following him. Think about that for a second. As a church member, we're here this morning. Many of us are faithful in our tithes and offerings. We're faithful about Sabbath keeping. We try to eat healthily. But is it possible that there could be Seventh-day Adventist Christians who do all of those things, but when they really boil down to their experience, are they really following Jesus, or are they really just kind of walking in the same direction he is? Think about your own experience. And what makes the difference is your intimacy with Jesus. Are you really following him? Is he your everything? To me, it's a sobering thought. It's a sobering thought. Remember, being a Christian, being a Seventh-day Adventist, is all about Jesus. Always has been, always will be. We're not just going in the same direction. We're following him. It seems that during the late 1800s, 1880s in particular, there was the Adventist church largely had lost sight of the fact that it was all about Jesus. Some of you remember your Adventist history. You studied this. There was this General Conference in 1888, which was very controversial. Very controversial. It was very divisive because there were a group who believed that we should keep the law, and we should keep the law, and we should keep the law. They believed that above all, we should emphasize law keeping. There were also a group of Adventists led by two young upstart preachers named Jones and Wagner who believed were teaching something called righteousness by faith. The general church had largely lost sight of this idea of righteousness by faith. They loved to talk about keeping the law. But Jones and Wagner began to point out that Christ is our righteousness. It's all about Jesus, always has been, always should be, but many of the brethren did not agree with them. And it was a very divisive period. If you want to go back and study it, it's a very fascinating period. Well, after this time period, in the early 1890s, a group of evangelists began to feel like it would be important to have a book that would emphasize Christian living, emphasize the importance of Jesus to our daily experience. And, of course, what we understand today is that because we love Jesus, and I'm not trying to say we shouldn't keep the commandments, but we understand today that because we love Jesus, that's why we keep the commandments. I think the earlier Adventists sometimes believed that we keep the commandments and that helps us love Jesus more. We love Jesus, and therefore we keep his commandments. And so there were a number of evangelists begin to suggest that perhaps a small volume could be prepared with some choice materials on conversion and the Christian life. And so the church asked Ellen White, to one of our pioneer leaders, asked Ellen White to produce a volume that would be about how to have conversion and how to walk in the Christian life. Now, what they did to prepare this volume was, by this time, Ellen White had written hundreds of articles or thousands of articles. And they had many been published in various magazines, particularly the Signs of the Times, particularly Review and Herald, and many letters to different people. And so what they did is Ellen White did not just sit down and start with the first word of Steps to Christ and write it to the end. They began to look at other things she had written. And so primarily the book Steps to Christ, I wasn't going to tell you that yet, primarily the book was compiled from other writings. And as they placed them before her, things that she had written before, she rewrote some of them and wrote new material And finally, in 1892, the book came out, and it was called Steps to Christ. This is an original edition of Steps to Christ. It was first published by a non-Adventist publishing company, Fleming H. Revell. Revell was a leading publisher in the late 1890s. And so Ellen White chose Revell to publish her book. There were a couple reasons why. Revell was publishing books by, you probably have heard some of these people. They were publishing books by D.L. Moody, by Spurgeon, by George Campbell Morgan. One of the most popular books they published during this late period in 1888. They published a book by Hannah Whitehall Smith, which was entitled The Christian Secret to a Happy Life. If I've read this book, it's in the same genre as the book Steps to Christ. It's a very good book. And so Ellen White, as she considered this book, decided that she wanted this book to be published by Fleming H. Revell with the hope that it would have a broader audience than if it were published by Review and Herald, and not just an Adventist audience, but a larger audience would read it. And that is indeed actually what happened. It was a very well-known and popular book. It was first, as I say, published in 1892. When Ellen White, by the time the book was actually published, Ellen White was in Australia visiting. And while she was in Australia, she writes this. She talks about that when the mails came from America, she says it brought a copy of Steps to Christ. And it had been announced on the back page of the Bible Echo, which was an Adventist publication. Now, Revell writes this about the book. They call it a remarkable book. And this is what they write. They say, it is not often that a publisher has the opportunity of announcing a third edition of a new work within 6 weeks of its first issue. Within 6 weeks, they had to print this book 3 times, which is really, really cool. Ultimately, it went through 7 editions by Fleming H. Revell, which is really, really cool to me. This is what they say. They say, Steps to Christ is a work to guide the inquirer, to inspire the young Christian, and to comfort and encourage the mature believer. The book is unique in its helpfulness. And so this is the original edition, 1892 edition. Now, you would think that these 1892 Revell editions would be really hard to find, but they're really not that hard to find because there were so many of them published. So I think that's really neat. This happens to be a really, really nice copy. I've had several copies through the years myself, but this is one that I have held on to. And actually, I have to tell you, Richard, this is one of your books you gave me. I'm looking at it. I'd forgotten that, but I'm looking at it here, and it's got that page in front that you put on many of your books. So Richard Singer actually gave me this edition of this book. So it's a very precious treasure to me. Now, later on, the book was published by Review and Herald. In 1896, Review and Herald put out the first edition with the Review and Herald Publishing Association trademark on the inside. It's fascinating to me. The books are identical. And I've concluded that actually Revell continued printing the book for Review and Herald after the copyright was changed, because the books, except for the color, the books are identical. Well, there's one other difference. In the later edition, they added one chapter to the book. You can see the chapters here. This is from the original edition. There were 12. The newer edition had 13. You can look at the chapter titles, and you can see it is indeed a book about steps to Christ. It starts out with God's love for man, the sinner's need of Christ, repentance, confession, consecration, faith, and acceptance. So you see here, each chapter is a step towards Christ. How can one become converted? And then it talks about the test of discipleship, growing up into Christ, the work and the life, the knowledge of God, the privilege of prayer, what to do with doubt, rejoicing in the Lord. You can see that each chapter is encouraging a person to take steps toward Christ and then steps with Christ to grow in Jesus. I have to tell you, this book I have read in my life more times than any other single book from start to finish. To me, it is probably the most important book that Ellen White ever wrote in her life. Some people like other books better. I remember visiting when I was in Mount Vernon, Ohio. I remember talking about at the beginning of one year, we had an emphasis on Steps to Christ and encouraged people to read the book Steps to Christ through, as I'm going to do in just a few minutes with you. But I was talking to this person, and they seemed to think that Steps to Christ was a little bit below them. I mean, they were mature Christians. They'd probably been Adventists for 40 years. And so to read the book Steps to Christ for them was like a baby Christian ought to read. But they like to quote from other Ellen White stuff, Series A and Series B and the Crest Collection, stuff you've never ever heard of. And then they like to quote a lot from the Testimonies to the Church. And she kind of gave me this attitude that Steps to Christ wasn't necessary for her anymore. Well, guess what? It is. I just read this book earlier this year. Since I knew it was the 125th anniversary this year, I just read this book earlier this year, and it is a blessing to read. Now, this book has been This book has been published. There are millions of copies of the book Steps to Christ. I put here on the front table, if you want to come up and look, a few of you might like to look at old books. I put on a bunch of editions of Steps to Christ, just for you to see how they've been given, through how they've been published through the years. A few years ago, they also published, because this book was written 125 years ago, it's not always easy to read the syntax and the vocabulary. So a few years ago, the Ellen White estate updated the book into something called Steps to Jesus, and especially for young people. And they've changed some of the syntax, and all kinds of stuff that editors would do. And that book is also available today, Steps to Jesus. I found it fascinating to find out that the book Steps to Christ by Ellen White, in the history of our world, the book Steps to Christ has been translated into 165 different languages. 165 languages around the world. That puts it, if you look, there are different lists out there, but according to the list I was looking at, 165 different languages puts Ellen White's book, Steps to Christ, at the 9th most translated book in the world. The 9th most translated book. The first most translated book is the Bible. Most languages. They said 469 languages in this list I looked at. It was shocking to me to find out what the second what the second book is with the most translated languages in the world. It is the book The Adventures of Pinocchio. Really? That's what I said. Really? The Adventures of Pinocchio. It's been translated into 260 languages. Or maybe the person who wrote this list is lying. I don't know. I found it fascinating when I looked at the list that the Jehovah's Witnesses have 3 books three books in the top 20 that have been translated into huge numbers of languages. The Pilgrim's Progress was above there. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne was at number 7. But Ellen White's book, Steps to Christ, was at number 9. And I found it interesting that the book Steps to Christ has been translated into more languages than the Quran. I found that interesting. And so I have this proposal for you. Proposal on the 125th anniversary of the book Steps to Christ. This is my challenge to you. My first challenge is that you read the book Steps to Christ through again. If you've done it before, that's wonderful. Do it again. There's only 13 chapters, and they're short chapters. If you would read one chapter a day, every day, it would only take you 2 weeks to get through the book Steps to Christ. Maybe you want to read one every other day. But I challenge you to stop and read the book Steps to Christ in the next couple of weeks. Many of you probably have a copy at home. If you don't have a copy at home, there are a couple hundred copies out on the foyer right now. You knew I was going to say that, right? There are a couple hundred copies out there. Please feel free to take one, take it home. It's your copy. Mark it up. Do anything you want to with it. My first challenge to you is to read the book Steps to Christ through in the next few weeks. The second challenge I have for you on the 125th anniversary is to give one copy each week away. Just take however many weeks you're going to take to read the book, give a copy away every week. I guess that kind of makes me wish you were only reading a chapter every week, so you do it for 13 weeks. But take some books. There's several hundred out there on the table. We have some various editions out there. This nice picture of Christ. My favorite cover on this book is the one of Christ knocking at the United Nations. I love this copy. We have some other. The book's been published under a number of different titles. Called this one's Happiness Digest, but it's the text of Steps to Christ. We have many of them out there. And so I encourage you to take some today and give at least one copy away this week. If you want to give 2 or 3 away, we will provide as many as you'll give away. And if we run out, we'll buy more. We will provide them. But there's also one other thing I want to challenge you to do. I want you to challenge you to write your name in it and your telephone number. Given by, and write your name in it. That way, and your telephone number. That way, if whoever you gave it to wants something else to read, they know how to contact you. Now, admittedly, many of these, I don't know if any of these up here do or not, many of them have labels in them already because we've done this. Yeah, this one has a label in it already that says, if you'd like more spiritual reading material like this, call, and it has the telephone number of the church, and leave a message. So some of them already are marked like that, but I challenge you to take the next step. Write your name in it and put your telephone number. Now, I got this idea a few years ago. This is going to sound really weird, okay? I got this idea a few years ago when I learned that over in Iraq, when the Iraq War started, bomber pilots would get paint or magic marker or something and would leave messages on the bombs. Something like, "This one's for you, Saddam." And so they wanted Saddam to know where that bomb was coming from. I know, it's a weird idea, isn't it? But I want people to know where your books have come from. And so therefore, I challenge you to write in the books your name and telephone number. I just want to share with you, as I close, I just want to share with you just a couple of my favorite quotes from the book Steps to Christ, just to whet your appetite just a little bit. This is in the chapter on the privilege of prayer. Well worth reading the whole book just to get to this chapter. It says, prayer is the opening of the heart to God as to a friend. Not that it is necessary in order to make known to God what we are, but in order to enable us to receive Him. Prayer does not bring God down to us, but brings us up to Him. Most of you have heard this, right? Same chapter. It says, why should the sons and daughters of God be reluctant to pray when prayer is the key in the hand of faith to unlock heaven's storehouses, where are treasured the boundless resources of omnipotence? Without unceasing prayer and diligent watching, we are in danger of growing careless and of deviating from the right path. And then one last one. This probably is my favorite, Steps to Christ, page 70. It says, consecrate yourself to God in the morning. Make this your very first work. Let your prayer be, take me, O Lord, as wholly thine. I lay all my plans at thy feet. Use me today in thy service. Abide with me, and let all my work be wrought in thee. This is a daily matter. Each morning, consecrate yourself to God for that day. Surrender all your plans to Him to be carried out and given up as His providence shall indicate. Thus, day by day, you may be giving your life into the hands of God, and thus your life will be molded more and more after the life of Christ. You know, if we would do this every single day, what she says here, consecrate yourself to God in the morning. If we do this every single day, we would never be simply walking in the same direction as Jesus. We'll be following Him. We'll be walking with Him. There's one last story I want to tell you about the book Steps to Christ. As I say, Ellen White was in Australia when she received her first copy of Steps to Christ. And as she was traveling around in Australia, she and her accompanying people, whoever was in her party, had to sail around in different places around Australia. And so they boarded a ship, it says, on December 13 for a 7-day ocean journey. She says it was a very, very difficult voyage. The waves were just unbearable, and they were washing up over the decks of the ship. And it was very difficult to sleep. It was very difficult to eat. And one woman in particular, a Mrs. McDonald, the stewardess, was very kind to Mrs. White. And Mrs. White, in appreciation for Mrs. McDonald's kindness, gave her a copy of Steps to Christ and some other pamphlets and papers. As Ellen White had the opportunity, she talked with her about her soul's salvation and pointed out the perils of any whose life was on the sea. This is what Mrs. McDonald replied. She said, if I could, I would be a Christian, but I cannot. And she said it would be an impossibility to serve God on such a vessel as this. Then she opened up and told Ellen White of the wickedness of the officers and the crew and how she wanted to seek a different place to work, but she had 4 children and she could make the most money working on this boat. And so she concluded with these words. She said, it is no use to pray here or try to be religious. A few weeks later, that ship was lost at sea. It went down. And there were only 2 survivors. And Mrs. McDonald was not one. She died in that boat. I don't know. No one knows. Did she ever read the book Steps to Christ? I don't know. But I know that now is the time to take steps to Christ. I urge you this week to take steps to Christ and steps with Christ this week. Do not delay. As we close, I want to go back to that quotation I told you I liked so well. And my wife and I, many years ago, wrote a little chorus. I think I've sung this for you before. but it's a perfect time to sing it again. We're going to sing it a couple times, just so you can get an idea of what it sounds like. Goes like this. Sing with me if you remember it. Take me, O Lord, as wholly thine. I lay all my plans at thy feet. Use me today in thy service. Abide with me, and let all my work be wrought in thee. I often sing this song when I have my devotions in the morning. I like morning devotion songs, so I often sing this. So sing it with me if you can. Take me, O Lord, as wholly thine. I lay all my plans at thy feet. Use me today in thy service. Abide with me, and let all my work be wrought in thee. Sing it one more time. Take me, O Lord, as wholly thine. I lay all my plans at thy feet. Use me today in thy service. Abide with me, and let all my work be wrought in thee. That's my prayer today. Amen.